The sun was warm on my shoulders, a gentle, benevolent heat that felt like a blessing from the universe itself. Around us, the garden we had poured our souls into bloomed in a riot of late summer color. Crimson roses climbed the trellises, their scent mingling with the sweet perfume of lavender lining the stone path. Laughter from our dearest friends and family, the people who had championed our love from the start, mixed with the soft, hopeful melody of a string quartet playing Clair de Lune, the song that was playing on the radio during our first clumsy, wonderful date. It was the 10th anniversary of our wedding, the day we were renewing our vows, and my heart was so full I thought it might burst from my chest. I looked at James, his hand steady and warm in mine. The familiar, handsome crinkles around his eyes deepened as he smiled at me, a smile that still, after all these years, made me feel like the only woman in the world. He was my rock, my harbor, the man who had shown me that love wasn't about grand, dramatic gestures, but about the quiet, unwavering strength of a hand to hold in the dark. And then there was Lily, our 6-year-old daughter, a tiny, radiant vision in a miniature white dress that matched my own, was flitting between the tables like a butterfly. Her bright, curious eyes, the same warm brown as her father's, were taking in everything with pure, unfiltered joy. Just a moment ago, she had run to me, her small hands clutching a fallen rose petal. "For your hair, Mommy," she had whispered, her voice full of solemn importance. She was the most beautiful thing we had ever created, the living, breathing symbol of our love. She was also the reason for the deep, 6-year-long chasm that had fractured our family. The last time I had seen my mother-in-law, Margaret, was at our first wedding. I can still picture her vividly, standing apart from the celebration, dressed in severe funereal black, her face a mask of cold, silent disapproval. She had made her feelings clear from the moment James told her he was marrying me. I wasn't from the right family. My career as a graphic designer wasn't substantial enough. I didn't possess the quiet, submissive grace she believed a wife, her son's wife, should have. "She's a spirited girl, James," I once overheard her saying to him, the word spirited laced with so much disdain it sounded like an accusation. Her presence in our newlywed life became a toxic fog of passive aggression and thinly veiled insults. The final explosive argument came 6 months after the wedding, on a cold Tuesday night right after we'd joyfully announced I was pregnant. Her response wasn't congratulations, but a chilling question. "Are you truly prepared to bring a child into this situation?" The situation was, of course, me. That was the night James, his voice trembling with a fury I had never heard before, told her that if she could not respect his wife, she would not be a part of their grandchild's life. We hadn't spoken since. Not a call on birthdays, not a card at Christmas, not a single acknowledgement of Lily's existence. Over the years, the sharp, stinging pain of her rejection had dulled to a quiet, persistent ache. We built our life, a fortress of love and happiness, and the silence from her became just another brick in its foundation. We were complete, I told myself fiercely. We didn't need her judgment or her coldness. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I would see the flicker of sadness in James's eyes when he looked at old family photos from his childhood, or I would feel a sudden, sharp pang of guilt that Lily would never know her father's mother. The music swelled, shifting into the melody we'd chosen for our walk down the aisle. James squeezed my hand. "Ready to do this all over again, Mrs. Davison?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "More than ever," I whispered back, my own voice catching. As we turned to face the celebrant, a sudden, unnatural hush fell over the garden. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was a tense, abrupt void. The laughter stopped mid-peal. The chatter died. I saw my best friend Clara freeze with her glass halfway to her lips, her eyes wide. A cold dread, sharp and horribly familiar, snaked its way up my spine. My gaze followed the stunned stares of our guests, drawn inexorably to the entrance of the garden path, and there she was, Margaret. She stood motionless, a severe, unsmiling figure dressed in a tailored navy suit that was as rigid and unyielding as her posture. She looked older, the lines around her mouth etched deeper, her hair a stark, unforgiving white. But her eyes were the same, a pale, piercing blue that felt like they could see every insecurity, every doubt I had ever had. She was not a guest, she was an apparition, a ghost from a past I had desperately tried to bury. The air crackled with unspoken questions. James's hand tightened on mine, his knuckles white. I could feel the shockwave ripple through him, a mirror of my own. For 6 years, she had been a phantom. A story I told myself was over. Now the phantom was flesh and blood, and she was standing at the edge of our perfect day, threatening to shatter it all. Time seemed to warp. Each step Margaret took on the gravel path echoing like a drumbeat, counting down to an inevitable impact. Her face was a blank canvas, impassive and unreadable, giving away nothing of the storm that must be raging within. The guests, our friends, the people who had celebrated our union, parted before her like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Her gaze was a laser, fixed on James and me, ignoring everyone else as if they were merely scenery. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. 1,000 thoughts, sharp and panicked, raced through my mind. Why now? After 6 years of deafening silence, why choose this exact moment? Was she here to object publicly? To create a scene so dramatic it would eclipse the happy memories we were trying to create? A wave of protective fury, hot and fierce, surged through me. This was my day, our day, a sanctuary we had built for ourselves. I would not let her burn it down. I tightened my grip on James's hand, a silent, desperate signal. We stand together, no matter what. I risked a glance at James. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. The healthy color the sun had given him had drained away, leaving him pale. This was his mother, the woman who had raised him, whose approval he had once craved with a child's desperation. I saw the war raging in his eyes, the fierce loyalty to me and the life we'd built, warring with the profound shock of seeing her, and beneath it all, the faintest flicker of a deeply buried, long-denied hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an attack. As Margaret drew closer, I instinctively shifted, placing myself slightly in front of Lily. My daughter had stopped her butterfly dance and was now staring, her brown eyes wide with a child's frank curiosity, at the stern-faced woman who had brought our celebration to a screeching halt. "Mommy, who is that lady?" Lily whispered, her small, clear voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence. The innocent question hung in the air, a stark counterpoint to the complex adult emotions crackling between us. It was in that moment that Margaret finally stopped, a mere few feet away. The string quartet had long since faltered into silence. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, a sound that suddenly felt deeply, terribly ominous. Margaret's gaze finally shifted from me to James, and in that fleeting second I saw a crack in her icy facade, a flicker of something I couldn't name, vulnerability, regret, fear. Then just as quickly the mask was back in place. Her eyes moved past us, past the patiently waiting celebrant, and settled on Lily. She stared at her granddaughter, the child whose existence she had ignored for 6 years, for a long, silent moment. The entire garden seemed to be holding its breath with us. I could feel the collective weight of our friends' and family's anticipation, their silent, urgent question mirroring my own. What is she going to do? Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not the loud, accusatory boom I had braced myself for. It was low, raspy, as if strained by long disuse. And it was directed not at me, not at James, but at the small child partially hidden behind my dress. "Hello, Lily," she said, the words stark in the quiet garden. "I am your grandmother." The 2 words, "your grandmother," fell into the sun-drenched garden like anchors dropped into a tranquil sea, sending shockwaves of disbelief and suffocating tension through the stunned silence. Lily, bless her pure and uncomplicated heart, did not flinch or hide. She had been raised in a world of gentle words and warm embraces. She had no frame of reference for this cold, sharp-edged intrusion. She simply tilted her head, her pigtails with their white ribbons bouncing slightly, and looked from the strange, severe woman back to me, her wide brown eyes seeking clarification. "Like Grandma Helen?" she asked, her voice, clear as a little bell, carrying across the unnaturally quiet space. The question was a dagger of pure innocence. Grandma Helen was my mother, a woman of soft sweaters and softer hugs, a woman who smelled of cinnamon and baking bread, whose lap was the safest harbor Lily had ever known. To mention her in the same breath as this stark, unsmiling figure was a child's honest attempt at categorization, but it landed with the force of an indictment. The comparison seemed to strike Margaret physically. A brief, almost imperceptible spasm of pain tightened her features before the mask of icy composure slammed back into place. Before I could find my voice, before I could formulate a response that wasn't a raw, guttural scream of, "Get out," James moved. It was a fluid, decisive motion. He stepped forward, planting himself squarely between his mother and his daughter, a human shield forged from 6 years of righteous anger and unwavering principle. "No," he said, his voice terrifyingly low, shaking with a cold, controlled fury that was far more frightening than any shout. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk away for 6 years, not a single phone call, not one birthday card, and then just show up here. You don't get to stand in the wreckage you created and claim that title. He took another step, his body radiating a protective heat. You lost the right to be her grandmother the day you decided her mother wasn't good enough for you. The accusation, sharp and lethal, hung in the air. I saw a few of our friends, the ones who knew the full painful history, give slow, grim nods of agreement. My own hand, which I hadn't realized I'd raised, was now resting firmly on Lily's small shoulder, my fingers digging slightly into the fabric of her dress. Margaret's gaze flickered from James's furious face to me, a silent acknowledgement of my place in this, and then back to Lily. There was no apology in her eyes, not yet, but the rigid, unbending certainty that had always been her armor seemed to have been replaced by something else, something brittle and fragile. "I know," she said, her voice raspy, as if it had to fight its way through layers of rust. It was a stunning admission from a woman who had never, in my memory, conceded fault in any matter, large or small. "I have no right. I know that. But I am here because I had no other choice." "There is always a choice, Margaret," I heard myself say, my voice a strained whisper but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You made yours every single morning for 2,190 days when you chose to remain a ghost to us. When you chose to let your own granddaughter be a stranger. And I was wrong," she choked out, the words seeming to tear their way from her throat. Her composure was finally cracking, the pieces falling away to reveal the raw desperation beneath. My pride. My foolish, poisonous pride. It cost me everything. It cost me my son. It cost me her. Her eyes found Lily again, and this time the emotion was naked and undeniable. It was a raw, aching regret, so profound it was almost frightening to witness. James didn't soften. He was a rock, unmovable. An apology doesn't erase 6 years of silence, Mother. So I'll ask you again. Why today? Of all the days, why pick this one? To ruin this for us too? To make sure no happy memory is untainted by you? "Because I might not have another day," she cried out, the words erupting from her in a torrent of raw, unfiltered desperation that finally silenced everyone, including James. The sudden shout, so out of character, stunned the garden into absolute stillness. Her hands, which were usually so steady and deliberate, trembled as she fumbled inside her expensive handbag. She pulled out a folded piece of official-looking paper. Her movements were clumsy, frantic. "I received a diagnosis, last week, from the clinic." Her voice broke, losing its sharp edge and becoming something fragile and thin. "It's aggressive. The doctors have given me a few months. A year, if I'm lucky. And they are never that lucky." The world stopped. It simply ceased to turn. The heat of my righteous anger, which had been a furnace in my chest just moments before, was instantly extinguished, doused by a wave of cold, numbing shock. This wasn't a play for power. It wasn't a narcissistic attempt to hijack our celebration. This was the last, desperate pilgrimage of a dying woman. I stared at James. His face was a battlefield of warring emotions. The fury was still there, a righteous fire, but it was flickering now, starved of oxygen, struggling against the overwhelming tide of shock and a deep, primal pain. This was his mother, the woman who had taught him to ride a bike, the woman who had held him when he was sick, and she was dying. The garden party, our beautiful vow renewal, the smiling faces of our friends, the delicate music, it all dissolved into an insignificant, blurry backdrop. The universe had shrunk to this small, fractured circle of 4 people, the air thick with the weight of terminal illness and years of unspoken grief. The sun still shone, a brilliant, indifferent star, but it no longer felt like a blessing. It felt like a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, illuminating every crack and every flaw in our broken family. My best friend, Clara, ever the pragmatist, finally broke the spell. She moved forward slowly, her heels sinking into the soft grass, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful sympathy. "Sophie James," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the chaos. Perhaps you should take this conversation inside." Clara's words hung in the air, a lifeline of practicality in a sea of raw emotion. James, however, didn't move. He stood rooted to the grass, his body a rigid wall of defiance. "No," he said, the word flat and final. "We're not going inside. There's nothing to discuss. She can leave the way she came." But I knew he was wrong. Everything had changed. The solid ground of our anger and resentment had given way to a terrifying, unstable landscape of grief and pity. We couldn't just turn her away. Not now. Not with the specter of death standing beside her. "James, please," I whispered, my hand finding his arm. It was like touching stone. Clara's right. Not here. Not in front of everyone. My plea seemed to break through his hardened resolve. He looked around, as if seeing our guests for the first time, their shocked, compassionate, and pitying faces. He flinched. Without another word, he turned and strode towards the house. His retreat was not a surrender, but a tactical withdrawal. I looked at Margaret, who seemed to be shrinking into herself, her newfound vulnerability a jarring contrast to the formidable woman I had always known. I gave her a short, sharp nod towards the house, and she followed, her steps unsteady on the stone path. The walk inside was the longest of my life. The air was thick with the things we couldn't say. I could feel the eyes of our friends on our backs, their silent questions following us. The joyful music of our celebration was a distant, mocking echo. We entered the living room, a space usually filled with Lily's laughter and the comfortable clutter of our life together. Now it felt like a courtroom. James stood by the fireplace, his back to us, staring at the family photos on the mantel. Pictures of him and me, of Lily's first steps, of beach holidays and birthdays. All memories from which his mother was painfully absent. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of quiet efficiency. "I'll handle things out here," she said softly, her gaze taking in the tense tableau. "I'll tell them something's come up. Don't worry about it." She then looked towards Margaret, her expression hardening almost imperceptibly, before softening as she looked at me. "Do you want me to take Lily to my place for a bit?" I felt a wave of gratitude so immense it almost brought me to my knees. "Would you?" "Thank you, Clara. I don't want her in the middle of this." Lily was in the kitchen, carefully arranging rose petals on a plate. She looked up as I entered, her expression untroubled. "Is that lady sick, Mommy?" "Her face is sad." I knelt down and smoothed her hair, my heart aching with the complexity of it all. "Yes, sweetie. She's not feeling well. You're going to go have a special playtime with Auntie Clara, okay?" I walked her to the door, giving her a hug that I hoped conveyed all the love and protection I felt for her. As Clara led her away, Lily looked back over her shoulder at me, a small, trusting smile on her face. The sight of it nearly broke me. When I returned to the living room, the silence was even more profound. It was just the three of us, trapped together by a web of history, betrayal, and a terminal diagnosis. The only sound was the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a stark reminder of the time Margaret had wasted, and the little time she had left. James finally turned from the fireplace. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out. The fury had receded, replaced by a deep, wrenching pain. He looked at his mother, truly looked at her, and the years of anger seemed to collide with the fresh shock of her mortality. He was the one to break the silence. "What do you want, Mother?" he asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was not a question of welcome. It was a demand for an objective. Margaret flinched at his tone. She clutched her handbag in her lap like a shield. "I want," she began, her voice trembling. She took a breath, trying to summon some of her old authority, but it failed her. "I want to not die as a stranger to my own family." Her eyes welled up, and she did not try to hide the tears. "I want to know her, James. I want her to have at least one memory of me that isn't of a ghost at a party. I know I don't deserve it. I know it's too late for forgiveness. I am not asking for that. I am just asking for a little time." The raw, desperate plea hung in the air, stripped of all artifice. It was the unvarnished truth of a terrified, lonely woman. There was no manipulation left, no pride, only the horrifyingly simple desire to not die completely alone. I looked at James. His face was a mask of anguish. I could see the battle raging within him, the loyal son who was hardwired to love his mother versus the devoted husband and father, whose primary duty was to protect his family from the very woman who was now begging for entry. 6 years of righteous anger couldn't be erased by a doctor's note. The wounds she had inflicted were deep and had shaped the very foundation of our family. But as I looked at her, at the tears carving paths through her makeup, at her trembling hands, I didn't see the monster from my memories. I saw a dying woman. I saw the source of James's pain, yes, but I also saw a human being stripped of everything, facing the ultimate abyss. And I thought of Lily. What would I want for her if I were in Margaret's position? What would I want her to do? My anger was a shield, and it had protected us well. But holding on to it now felt less like strength and more like cruelty. Forgiveness felt like a distant, perhaps unreachable shore. But compassion? Compassion was something I could offer today. I walked over to the window and looked out at our garden. Our guests were gone. All that remained were the beautiful flowers, the empty chairs, and the remnants of a party that had been shattered. But the garden itself was still there. The roots were still strong. It could be beautiful again. I turned back to face the room. James's eyes met mine, filled with uncertainty, searching for an answer. He would stand by whatever I decided. I was the one who had borne the brunt of her cruelty. The final word had to be mine. "All right, Margaret," I said, my voice quiet but firm, cutting through the heavy silence. "We're not promising forgiveness. I don't know if that will ever be possible." James looked at me, his expression unreadable, but he didn't protest. He waited. I took a breath, the decision settling in my heart, heavy and fragile all at once. "But we can offer you time." I looked towards the empty doorway where our daughter had recently stood. "You can come over next Saturday? For 1 hour? You can meet Lily? Properly this time?" It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a reunion. It was a beginning, born from an end. It was a single fragile bridge built across a 6-year chasm, offered not for the woman who had hurt us, but for the woman who was about to die. It was, in the end, the only choice we could live with. Life is too short to be defined by the wounds of the past. Sometimes the most courageous act is not to forget, but to choose compassion in the face of pain. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of hope and reconciliation.